to open data standards for collaboration, and it serves to introduce how open data standards can help speed up the development of civic tech, app, and services, as well as foster collaboration between different users. And for that, I'm going to present Khairil Yusof. He's a coordinator at Sinar Project, as well as an independent investigative journalist working on applying innovative methods of open data and standards for transparency and anti-corruption. He is also currently coordinating the Open Data for Development Network, Asia Hub, OD4D Asia program. And thank you so much and welcome, Khairil.
Hey, hi, thanks for having me on. Great, so should I start? Yeah, cool. Okay, so I hope this is gonna try to make it interesting. It seems dry, but I promise it starts getting more exciting later on. Like open standards seems like a dry topic, so I'm gonna start my presentation now. Where's my share? I think this is it. Okay, so everybody can see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah, okay,
yes,
good. Great, so I'll start. So I'm gonna start with a little bit of history, because open standards is not anything new. So I'm gonna go a little bit history. It seems kind of straightforward that, something that's an open standard should be, easily accessible for all to read and use. It's, developed by a process that's open and for anyone to participate in. And there should not be any control or tie-in by any specific group or vendor. So it seems kind of straightforward now, but we've had to actually fight for quite a lot of this for the past 20 years, especially in the IT field, for this to become commonplace. So we're in a far better place now. And I'll go through some of the problems before. So for an example, in terms of easy accessibility for all to read and use, years ago, you would have standards where it's just obfuscated XML where you can barely understand what the heck the different fields are. So they would publish it and nobody would be able to read it. You'd have a process that's controlled where you had to pay high sums and fees to just even participate or to contribute or even download a standard. And sometimes they would be, again, through similar means controlled by a specific group of vendor. So luckily in our day and age now, we don't have that much of that problem anymore. So yeah, it's just a quick brief trip down history lane. So you remember, for those of you who are a little bit older, the issue with IE5, IE6, IE7, IE8, we had browsers, web pages that just don't display well from one browser to another. Even though it was an HTML standard, it became kind of like a proprietary standard where it was difficult to even build an application that would work across browsers. So for some time, and we've probably seen these sort of issues where you try to access a government website and it says you're using the wrong browser. Use IE, not even only IE 6.0. So if you upgraded your PC, you had to keep an older version just to access a government service. And a similar thing happened. Sometimes there would be plugins where if you're like certain things would only work on Windows, and if you were using a Mac, it wouldn't work, and so on. So yeah, a lot of issues about incompatibility. You couldn't reuse things. Each one had a lot of custom patches. It resulted in systems that were costly to upgrade, and it created a vendor lock-in. And I'm actually going to go touch on this topic a little bit later on why why it's still a problem now in terms of vendor lock-in. And of course, there's good open data standards. So I'm just giving an example. MIDI is one. So it's a simple standard, but it's been around since the 80s. Everything works if you're doing music. A more recent trend is like USB storage. So, you can see here, there's a whole bunch of different USB sticks, but most likely you're just going to be able to plug it into any PC and be able to read through it. Similarly, it's a USB keyboard. You don't need any drivers, or you buy USB speakers and so on. You can just plug it in, and this is because there are good open standards. So it doesn't matter if you're using a Mac or an Android phone or a Windows PC. If you plug it in, it's going to work most of the time anyways. And my best example, and the ones that kind of, and because it's such a good example of what good open standards processes are, and is going to lead up to the adoption of open standards for data and civic tech, is our internet standards. And they're so, I mean, anytime somebody says that, any counter or criticism on why something should be an open standard, I always counter back with the internet. So I've heard it all. If you have something that's open and everybody can reuse it, it's going to hinder innovation. I can't profit off it, or it would be insecure and so on. And or how an open process can hinder the development of a standard. So the internet standards such as TCP/IP, email, and so on, that have been around since the 1970s, as well as the process with IETF. So this is a bit dry. I promise it gets a little bit more interesting later on. But it does provide a little brief history. So again, standards on how we create, how we write standards, the vocabulary, and so on. A lot of it goes back to internet standards and processes, mainly because it has been working so well over decades, and it's an open. More recently, of course, related to internet standards is the W3C standard, which is again another open process for development of standards. So I mean, you can use it for anything. So I'm just putting here, I think it was done as an April Fool's, about where somebody actually in 1990 used the internet standards to actually RFC process to actually do a specification for transferring IP using carrier pigeons, basically. So it's an example of things that can be open, and people actually provided feedback on what kind of pigeons is it a European pigeon or rock pigeon, and so on. But it just shows an example where the processes can be fun, and it can also be used in other ways as well. And as such, this has carried over. As such, these processes have carried over, and I'm going to cover through. So open data standards now carries the legacy of these good processes and takes the best of what has happened throughout history, including processes. Yeah, for those of you not so familiar with open data, well, it's not too different from open source, but in terms of data, again, you'll see common wording such as availability of access, must be easily downloadable, anybody can reuse it, it's convenient, modifiable, where everybody must be allowed to reuse and redistribute, just like the standards before. If I download open data, I can copy it, I can share it, I can modify it without restrictions. And again, we hear this again, participation. Everybody should be able to participate in using it, developing solutions for it, and it should not have any restrictions like non-commercial and so on. It should be as applicable for you to build, businesses around as it is for researchers to use it for, or civil society to use it for nonprofit purposes. A common criticism with data is, and there's been quite a push for this for the past several years, for governments to be more open about data to publish it, is that quite often it's got poor quality, it's incomplete, it's inconsistent, and quite often it's on the focus of publication of data, which is often government driven. And then we also have another barrier in terms of the actual use cases, in terms of who's actually providing feedback into what sort of open data is actually being published in what formats and so on. And because it's a technical barrier, you get less input on it, from civil society, from tech and so on, and you end up getting data that you can't actually use. So lots of data and you can't use it. So some more complaints about civic tech. It's the data is there, but you can't build an app. You can't do research analysis because it's got poor quality. Or another one is that you got lots of different data, but it's incompatible. The definitions are different, the date formats are different, the values are different. I mean, one example is, for example, in terms of disaster management, for example, when you say something, when a value says it can house 4 people, is that a tent? Is that a tent that's for a family? And so on. Like so what happened in a real situation like years ago for the tsunami in Asia was that they said tents, and people would say the value for I'm going to donate 500 tents, but they didn't actually specify was it what kind of weather it was for and so on. And then another person said, we've got shelter. Well, is that like a tent or it's not? So you can see how all these kind of things just create problems in building solutions or even coordinating with each other. Another situation with data, and it's quite common with government, is that the data that's being published is only for one specific use case. So, and usually it's related to a website or a government service. So it's published by probably for one specific use, let's say a website and one service. And it's only using the data that was done by that specific development or app. So again, it's published, but it's not in a format that you can actually do anything with it because it doesn't have enough things. And a common problem that I often see is that, you have a bad government app, which leads to them publishing bad data, or you have bad data leading to development of bad applications and government services. So these are all the kind of things that we see from the data viewpoint. And it's, I believe it's quite common internationally as well. So how do we fix this? So basically, we need to have some sort of standardization in terms of how we publish this data. And it should follow the same things that we were discussing before. It should be open. It should be easy to read. And people should be able to participate in the development of these standards. So all these things should be done for data as well. So the best way I can kind of do this explanation that's kind of clear is through the simple animation. So one of the things that we often have with data is that, we have bits and pieces of it. And like a jigsaw puzzle, it's not clear exactly what we're working with, right? So if we have, open data standards, at least we have a little bit clarity. It's like a puzzle with numbers instead. So yeah, it's kind of we know that this is a picture of a person now, despite the missing pieces. So we know what's missing. And we have an idea of what we're looking at now instead of just some random pieces of information. The other situation, of course, is that you have lots of data. So you can kind of tell this is a person, but there's so many pieces of information, you're not really understanding like, what is the picture? Like, what is it showing? Conflicting data and so on. So of course, if you have a clear standard on data, you can put all these pieces together. And well, in this case, it's Malaysia's prime minister who was involved in a corruption scandal. But yeah, so having structured open data will make it a lot clearer for us. Going back to this, for those of you who are developers, I just mentioned that open data standards, we follow existing standards and processes. So mostly because the world we live in right now revolves around web development and apps and so on, that usually, a lot of the standards adapt W3C standards. And the schema is usually in JSON, although sometimes they also have it in other formats like RDF or XML. So it's something that us civic tech people immediately see. So when somebody is talking about let's publish Parliament data, and the app developer is like, what do you mean? As soon as I show him the JSON schema or her the JSON schema, it's like, okay, I know what you're talking about. So it's like a common language, and it's something that for us, for those of you who are developers, it's easy to get into and contribute. Versus maybe, let's say, the USB standards or something that's a little bit over my head. But open data standards are relatively easy to get into because of the common language of app developers. Okay, so this is getting the fun part. So we got the dry part out of the way. So it's like, how does, these kind of things, like, we're talking about open participation, it should be inclusive and so on. So where does the collaborations happen? So one environment that we quite often have in the Global South, but it can actually happen in other areas as well, is what I call a constrained environment for data. And these constrained environment on the availability of data can be either political or technical. So it could be that, there's just not enough, government isn't at a stage of, being digital, for example. So all you've got is paper. Or it can be political, especially when you're talking about transparency or corruption. The data is hard to get on purpose. And I always say this on corruption, there's a reason why it's so hard to get. It's just because people don't want it available. And there's also, and I put this with quotation marks, on a lack of expertise in terms of either working with data or even understanding of data. And I put that in quotation because not knowing the data standard doesn't necessarily mean that you're not an expert on the subject matter and so on. So in this case, we shouldn't see it as a kind of negativity. It's just certain aspects of the component where we're not able to implement, or publish good data or collect data because we're lacking certain expertise. Whereas you might know something, but you need another part to it to get it done. One case example that I've often shown, and I did it at the last Code for All Summit in Bucharest, as well as the one in Taiwan, is what happened to Myanmar after their first elections. So Myanmar was under military junta. It's a country in Southeast Asia. It was under military junta for decades, and they just had their first election with a very young population. So the first time ever, they had elected representatives that they voted for. And now, of course, being a young population, they wanted to have easy access. They want to have apps for it. They want to Google and find out who the person they elected is, like what's their contact number. Who's my representative that that we just voted in, and as a result, they had like over a dozen different civil society groups, all kind of collecting this information. Some were collecting pictures, some were collecting the addresses of their offices, some were collecting age and so on, or specific ethnicity. Ethnic backgrounds that they were representing. And the problem was that, well, everybody was collecting different bits and pieces, and there was no way to actually put it together. So in the case of Open Luthra Myanmar, we collaborated with Sinar Project and the NGOs there. And we adopted an international data standard called Popular Spec. And we basically put it in a spreadsheet. Sorry, it's in Burmese, but it doesn't matter because it's just an open data standard. And basically, we picked Popular Spec legislative data standard, which is being used in various parts around the world. I think Open North in Canada, My Society in the UK, Sinar Project in Malaysia, GovZero in Taiwan. And I think Cartography was also using it as well in Latin America. We just said, okay, this is the standard that has been developed by others around the world. And generally when they're building their applications, like My Societies, They Work For You, and so on, they're using this standard. So if we have it, if we all collect it together in this standard in a spreadsheet, and we just use Google Docs and put all the bits and pieces from all the different NGOs, we should be able to build applications like what the other countries have built, without going through the process of building, their own standard. And it worked. I think after putting it into a spreadsheet, we could then share with the developer, the schema that I just showed, the JSON schema. We exported it to that, and they were able to build a website with all, I think, 600 of their elected representatives within 2 weeks or something. And we were able to do this without actually ever meeting in person. So we were using a specification being developed at that time by James McKinney in Open North, Canada, based on what we knew, what My Society was doing for They Work For You, and with local knowledge of implementation by Sinar Project. And we just did it all virtually. And we all spoke a common language: JSON, open data standards, and legislative data, and Google Docs spreadsheet. They ended up building an app as well. And all of this was provided by all the different NGOs working together. So whenever there was an update, they just updated the Google spreadsheet, and it could update the application. They built, and then about a month later, they were able to build apps for it as well, because the data was also published as open data, so anybody could build apps or do research around it. The other advantages of it was the fact that because the data followed an open data standard, it meant that we could also reshare analysis of that data. So in Malaysia, for example, I already had some analysis for my use case in Malaysia to see what was the gender balance between the political parties. And because OpenLuthor used exactly the same standard, I basically just cut and pasted it, and it came out with a result of parties that I can't read, but it works because we were sharing a common data standard. So again, you could, this is another example where you can kind of reuse code, even for countries where you don't speak the language, because we're talking, we're sharing the same open data standards. In Malaysia, we had a slightly different situation. We had a politically constrained environment where information on our, oh cool, so somebody asked for the download presentation. Yes, I'll provide a link after this. So in Malaysia, it was hard to get information. So in terms of our parliamentarians, we only had basic information on just about a third of, we have 222 parliamentarians, and we only had basic information on about 66 of them. The rest, we didn't even know what background they were, like what jobs they held. We didn't even know how they looked like it sometimes. That was the state of democracy in Malaysia, like about 8 years ago. So this kind of information was hard to get. But similarly, in a slightly different, but in a similar situation to Myanmar, we had different NGOs, we had media, all kind of trying to get this information. So media reporting on elections and day-to-day reporting was also collecting information about the parliamentarians, what they worked for, backgrounds, and so on. There was another NGO that was working on better access to elected representatives. And they were also collecting their own data based on their surveys and their workshops. And of course, at Sinar, we were trying to build apps, and then we realized that we only had such limited information. We couldn't even build a website because we didn't have, everything was just empty fields for like about 200 of our, about 160 of our parliamentarians. So what we did was, we're like, okay, since this kind of information that all of us are trying to get is so hard to get, let's pool our resources together and store it in an open data standard, which is popular spec. And just like our friends in Myanmar, we're like, okay, let's all contribute what we know from this, and let's all keep contributing to the single database. And because it's open data, we're all going to reshare and reuse this, this data. And again, what we found out, interestingly for this, was that the original intention was just to build a parliamentarian website. What we found out later was that, well, we could actually use it for statistics. We could use the names of the politicians in the open data to build relationship graphs. And we could also use the same names for anti-corruption as well, because now we have a updated list of all of our elected representatives that we can match to contracts and so on, which was quite, so it was a good use of that. And every time one of the partners had more data, everybody benefited from it. So it provided a way. So for us, we kind of showed that with open data status and collaboration, there's another situation where if you don't have enough data, that you can actually create it through collaboration. So the open data standard becomes kind of like a little pot where everybody contributes something to. Okay, so this is pretty important, and this is where I think civic tech developers are the bridge. We're kind of the bridge between the tech and the social part, right? So we're quite often you only have developers, and then on the other side you have civil society or government. And so as a result, these standards are only as good as the contributions and feedback that we add to them. And if they're an international standard, everybody is actually contributing to it and benefiting from it, not just our local communities. So in this case, for example, in implementing some of the things that we needed to do in Malaysia, we found out that, you know, there's certain standards, certain fields that we needed in populist spec that were important to us in Malaysia. And as such, we contributed back. And this is where, for us as Civic Tech, it's pretty easy. These things are on GitHub, pull requests, submit a field, and so on, which you know, our civil society partner might not be able to do. And as a result, we contribute back and make it better. As you can see in this example for populist spec, I think we have a Canadian example for alternate names. We have what seems to be an American company for for different names. The example for the parent organization is House of Commons, which is a UK parliamentary organization. So you can see in just this one standard how everybody around the world is contributing, and each one of this kind of use cases makes it richer for everybody else implementing it. So one example I can't remember, it was one of the European countries. They had a situation where their politicians kept changing parties. Or alliances, and because of their experience, they actually had their field. So when we did it in Malaysia, when one of our public users said, you know, we should track these politicians that keep changing political parties all the time, we're like, oh wait, the standard's already there because somebody in Europe did it. So we didn't have what we built already had these things that were already built from lessons learned from other countries. So again, it's a collaborative thing, and each contribution back, and especially from countries like that are not already represented, is helpful for everybody else. It also causes us to think of the standards in different ways. So we have some pretty lively discussions on why something should or should not be in. And I'm like, yes, but in Malaysia. So I'll give a funny example on this. So one of these lively discussions was originally the popular spec was supposed to be just for legislators. And here in Malaysia, we're arguing like, no, our legislators are also businessmen who are also involved in shady deals. They're not just politicians. So the standard has to also include businessmen who are ex-politicians or close to politicians. So in Malaysia, what was interesting is when we actually added all the information, of all the businesses, we actually ended up having interesting links of, connections of which politician is involved, connected to which politician and which companies they were involved in. So I put a picture of Donald Trump there because he's a pretty good example. So when he got elected, he didn't actually exist in any data set because he was a businessman. So everybody else in the US up to that time was usually a congressman or had some sort of position in a political, some sort of political position. So so when Trump got elected, and then with it all his companies and so on, we were like, see, like this is what we were talking about. So this is the kind of things where contributions by everybody helps make the standard, even for things that you don't originally see. Just as well, just as the party jumping politicians, we learned about it from the Europeans. Connections between business and politicians, whereas all the same thing is now happening in the US, where it's a really common thing in Malaysia and possibly some other countries as well. So it works. The other part that's kind of interesting is the fact that this technique or standards can be applied to other things as well, especially when we're working with other civil society. So my example here is like a form. Actually, I think it's one of our older forms, right? So generally, a lot of forms and surveys that we do as civil society are not very well structured in terms of data structures, and sometimes they don't have it. They're not complete, or you can't do data analysis on it. So as best as possible, we should try not to reinvent the wheel, but try to improve the data that's being collected by others. So I'm just giving examples like on police report, welfare, and electoral data, and so on. And we should be able to apply these same techniques of open data standards, working with civil society to improve their forms. It doesn't even have to be an app in the end. But if, for example, a police report form is following a good international standard in terms of the data it's collected, further down the line, when maybe they move to a digital system, or even if we enter that into an application, it would already have all the information that you need to build your fancy apps and analysis and so on. And it could also mean a more efficient police force as well, because they're going to be able to have all these things that, all the standards that make better police enforcements that's backed by data. That they might not have had before with their simple forms. And of course, when we involve civil society in all these things, we can also apply things such as privacy and issues on risk and harm reduction and so on. So if everybody collaborates on these sort of things from the start, the forms that are being collected by government before they're even building their applications would have these sort of things built in, rather than after the fact. And then we find out that 5 million records were leaked and we had like personal information all over the place. So on a bigger scale for this, that's currently happening for COVID-19. And this is just an example of where open data standards and work around this area can bring so many people together, is on the definition of COVID-19 data sets that are needed by different countries. So for example, if you needed to ensure food and nutrition security, what kind of data do we need to collect? What kind of forms do we need from the government agencies? What kind of data on do civil society need in terms of providing help and so on? And this is a common, all these sort of things in terms of key data sets that we need to deal with COVID-19, socioeconomic, crime, food, welfare, health, through the development of these kind of common standards, like we can all collaborate together so that we know we have kind of the best practices and input from around the world on what's the best sort of data that we should need. So yeah, I think the Open Data Charter is leading this, but you can see there's a whole bunch, Open North in Canada, the OECD, we have OD4D, we have GIFT, I think that's in the UK, we have CAF development for Bank of Latin America and so on. I think CAF is, yeah, in the Caribbean. So there's a whole lot of different organizations coming in, and just as I shared before, these are all open participatory things. So anybody can kind of come in and contribute to these standards. I might share a link to this, but you can also contact the Open Data Chatter to be part of it. It's a collaborative format. Okay. The next step in terms of collaboration is, things that we often want to do with civic tech. And we want innovation. We want things that are new, different ways to work in terms of better government applications and so on. And so a common problem for that in civic tech is, again, we have this problem where, we need to kind of remove some monopolies of large government vendors, because they're not publishing data that we can use, or the formats are in a proprietary format or database structure that only works for that application. So it's hard for us to build on these things. And the data that they publish is often a subset of what you actually need to innovate or build your applications on. So these are some examples of where you can break you can break some of these monopolies that happen in a lot of countries. I think somebody shared in Code for All Slack, I think it was Sweden who had the same issue as well. So one common problem for procurement is that generally it's like one big system, like it's like, what do you call it, like ERP, for those of you know that jargon. It's like one big system, and it's usually by one vendor. So the contracting processes and so on might be transparent and open, but the system itself is just done by a vendor. So every time you want a new feature in, the government says, we can't do that. Can you publish this data? Sorry, we don't have that feature with our vendor. Or why don't we just add this feature in? Like, we can't because the vendor says it's not supported and so on. And these things are quite common for a lot of large government applications. So I thought this one example from Ukraine, a lot of people focus on their app, but I found their way of breaking the procurement kind of monopoly was really good. So what they did was they adopted the Open Contracting Data Standard as the central database, but which is managed by government. And based on these rules of the open data in terms of access and so on, that's set by the government, different vendors can actually build user interfaces around their procurement system. So you could have 5 different companies building a better tendering application, for example, which all would be compatible and write to this open data standard database that the government sees. So the government can then, so then on the user side, businesses can use the best service that they like. And in terms of government, they end up having a better procurement process in terms of more bidders and more vendors and so on. And even for their own interface, if they don't like it, they can actually just switch a vendor and say, can we have another vendor provide us a better interface? Or in this case, Transparency International, who was doing monitoring procurement, could actually have access to that data and build another system that was just monitoring for corruption. So again, it breaks this monopoly of a single procurement thing. This is going to be pretty hard, but it's a good example of how you can break that monopoly. And the government then is not beholden to a single vendor, and you can build this ecosystem. Another example for open contracting is OpenOps in the UK. So OpenOps collects all the different kind of all the different procurement tenders from EU, US, and so on, and puts it in one standard format. And now you can search globally every tender around the world in a consistent format. But you can also do other fun things with it, like business analysis. It's like, how much, what are the standard things that EU government is contracting for some goods versus, say, the US? or Canada. So that's, and it also encourages other countries to publish it, because if there's a global marketplace where everybody can kind of see this, if governments do this and publish their procurement contracts that are, that are open to international tenders, that data then can be, they'll attract a much bigger market than just a local player. So that should increase international trade as well. So there's lots of, these are just some examples of the things that can happen with open data standards. The other one is when you're building an app and you're not, either you don't have enough resources or you're not an expert in the field. So another interesting thing is that if the data standard has been created by a lot of experts and you build your application on it, it's going to be compliant with all the things that these experts have put into it, right? So in this case, I needed to build a system relatively quickly by myself to track construction projects. So I am nowhere close to being an expert on infrastructure projects. But so how would I quickly build one to see, in my case, I just wanted to track corruption. I wanted to understand better about corruption that happens or cost overruns in infrastructure projects. I wanted to build an app on it. So the first thing I did was basically look for an open data standard for it and just redid it. And in a short time, I could build this app, and it has every field and standards that are used by, that have been determined by much larger and better, smarter people or larger organizations and much smarter people. This is what it should be collecting and how it should look like. And most of all, I could actually tap into these international experts or the larger community and ask them, it's like, hey, I'm building this, and how should I implement this standard, and actually learn from them. So now I've got a compliant application that is compliant with the open contracting data standards for infrastructure to track large infrastructure without me knowing that much in detail about how to build such an app. So that's one example. Another example, which is quite global, is we actually had a common use case in Myanmar as well as in Malaysia, where we wanted to have the transcripts in Parliament made available online or as a website or an app. Depending on which country you're in, but most democracies have a legislative assembly or parliament where, your politicians all debate or make speeches and all sorts of discussions. So how do I build an app around that? Or how should I, how can I have something like what my society has? And I'll show that in a bit. So again, when Myanmar wanted to do this, with the Ananda, they're like, okay, what's the international standard for this? And they use, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Akomatoso. So originally it was developed in Africa for Parliament, and part of it is it's a standard to store transcripts of speeches and so on. So the Ananda adopted that, and you can see that they've got a really nice website now. I think it only took them about a month or so, where they scanned documents and then put it into this format to build this application. And it's the same, so say it is my society's implementation. So for Sinar, because we're in Malaysia and we're a Commonwealth country, we tend to look at what my society does and like, we want to have what you have. And my society provides it, as an open source format. So again, we're like, so in preparation to have what the UK has with SAY, we started converting our parliamentary discussions into the Akomatoso format as well. And by adopting this, we can be quite confident that, one, we can either reuse what my society has, or that if we wanted to build such an app, that the standard would have everything that we need to do it, because my society has already implemented it, as well as our friends in Myanmar. So yeah, so this is another example of you know, it's originally developed in Africa, but it's used in UK, and now we're using it in Malaysia and Myanmar. And we're better for it because we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Okay, cool. Yeah, and there's other things. And the final part of my talk is the fact that this extends to other fields as well, beyond just kind of building apps and so on. And I have a couple of words here. Harmonization, I'm not sure even that's the right word, but I hear it a couple of times, is where we kind of, or a common framework is where people from different fields and different backgrounds are able to kind of have, you know, common vocabulary to talk about things. And it's quite interesting to see how much you have actually in common. I'm going to give examples on that later. Once you actually speak a common vocabulary, it's like, oh, okay, you call it open something. Oh, I call it this. And basically you're talking about the same thing. So open standards also, open data standards also opens this way. It's kind of like a little Rosetta Stone where two people that seemingly speak, you know, different languages because of different fields are actually working on the same thing, and you open doors for collaboration that you didn't think about on both sides. And a little bit further along for this, and I think there should be something done by ILDA, which is, I think, can't remember what it is in Spanish, which is an organization for open data in Sophia might just come in for this. But yeah, they're a multinational group working on open data. Is, you know, in terms of this work on open data standards, like how does it contribute towards data sets that we need for AI and machine learning as well, right? Yes, okay, so Latin American Initiative on Open Data. I always know that it's just ILDA. Okay, so here's an example. And again, I'm kind of using open contracting, but because I'm more familiar with this field, but it should work for other data standards as well. So for anti-corruption and investigations, like for journalists and so on, like we're kind of looking at the same thing, but we need a common language. So if you're a person who's not a procurement expert, you can still understand a problem when you see it. You know, something's priced too much, or hey, how come that's the only company that got it? And that, you know, why is it the only company that got it? You know, like even if you're a layperson, you can kind of feel suspicious on this. And journalists also have the same kind of instinct as well. Like something's not right. In this case, for example, and this is the work of George from Open Contracting, is that he mapped out all the different problems that people are discussing into the open contracting framework. So now it's like, okay, so for example, in this case, it's like the issue of the tender is at 3 p.m. on a Friday and the deadline is 5 p.m. before that weekend, right? This is actually happens quite a lot. In Malaysia, I've seen one where it's like the deadline is, they publish it the day before a 2-week public holiday. And then the deadline is after the public holiday, right? Thursday afternoon and so on is like for publication. So you know that this is weird, but where does it fit into an open contracting, you know, format or procurement? So when you have these kind of data standards, you can kind of actually map these things out. And now if I'm a person who's not in procurement, I have an idea now, oh, it's in the tender part of it, of this process for procurement. And this is where I should be looking for more information, either as, you know, civil society, a concerned citizen, or somebody who's doing investigations for this story. So it's like, hey, this doesn't look right. I'm a journalist. Like, what should I be looking at? So now if I know that that's an issue related to the tender format, then I can look at the standards for open contracting and see it's like, oh, okay, I should be looking for these things like tender notices, specifications, values, who's inquired, and so on. So now I can even ask a person who's a procurement expert and ask them, it's like, hey, I noticed that my problem is related to tenders. Can you tell me more about the process? So now you can actually have a common language to talk to, even though you're not a procurement expert. And then now they're like, oh yeah, you should look at this, and so on. And then now, if you're a journalist or a civil society, you now know where that you need to look for this problem. So what I tend to do then is that it's like, okay, if this is a problem here, then let me look at all these other tender notices as well and see if that same problem is happening, you know, in other places as well. So that's an example of the mapping. Here's another example where something seems too daunting for either investigations or for anti-corruption folks. So large infrastructure projects, they're often billions of dollars. It's hard for a person on the outside or, you know, without in this deep industry knowledge to even understand. But everybody understands that something that has a $4 billion cost overrun, there's something wrong with it. You don't need to be an expert to know that there's something wrong with it. So how do I break it down and investigate something this big and simplify it? So just as my little animation that I showed before, that, you know, you can kind of break it into pieces or know where to ask the questions. So again, my approach for this is like, okay, is there a data standard for infrastructure? So I actually Googled this. It's like, oh, okay, there's actually engineers that are saying that for a construction project, these are the sets of fields that you should have. So now I would go into there and start asking, it's like, okay, these are the questions that I should be looking for this project. Like, you know, when's the start date? Is there an environmental impact assessment thing? So the engineers at Cost Transparency have actually said, you know, a project of this size should have all of this. So now, as a journalist, I'm going, cool, okay, I'm going to try to look for an environmental impact assessment report. I'm going to find out for a budget, and then I know what to ask government officials for using this data standard. And if it's not there, I'm like, and I'm going to share this little example. Is that then I know what to ask. It's like, hey, I'm a reporter. Can you provide me the number of firms tendering for this? Like, you know, even though I'm not so then going back before, it's like, why should I do that? Because now I know what kind of problems are going to happen in the tender part of it. So I'm now being guided to slowly understand where this $4 billion went to and where it could have gone wrong. Yeah, so in this case, Cost IDS or their infrastructure data standard actually said these are the things that you should have in terms of key documents. So as a journalist, or even as a researcher, I'm gonna start asking for this. Where are these documents? To start understanding where the $4 billion went to. Yeah, so again, same language is like, I might not know exactly what the heck is a resettlement and compensation plan, but I'm going to ask for it because I know that they need that. The government should have done that for that. So, and what's also interesting for this is that even as journalists or researchers, once you start having these conversations and understanding a common framework, you start seeing things in a whole new light. So a simple press statement, and politicians love to do this, announcing a bridge or announcing a new airport or a new highway and so on, actually provides quite interesting details. So now, before I thought like, oh yeah, it's just another project launch. Having this framework, and I'll just go back, of knowing what I should be asking for and what information I'm looking for. When I see this press release, this is in Bahasa, which is in Malay, in Malaysian language, but I'm now looking at it on the whole thing. It's like, okay, who procured it? What's the budget? Who's administrating this project? They should have a fund, like who's funding this? And you know, it's suspended. So there's a start date and it's past the suspended date. Like what happened to it? So this is not a new project. So I'm starting to see it in terms of the data structures, but also understanding that this is not from the standards that I saw before, this is not a good construction project. There's a lot of questions here I need to ask. So if it's a press conference now, and they're doing this press statement, as a journalist, I can now start asking these questions. You don't need to be an expert, but I can use the standards because now I know it. Excuse me, can you please provide a detailed project description and budget? Like, because it's not, there's not being provided. And if they can't answer it, then you can have more questions on that. Your story now becomes more than just basic reporting because of open data standards. Just coming towards the end now, like what else can you do for this? So if you're in civic tech and you know how to work with data and you know how to do code, in this example, you can now start doing algorithms as well. So if you have the amounts of data and they're saying these are the common problems that are applying in the tender process, you can now start coding algorithms, and you can, because you're all looking at the same data standard, you're actually all can contribute to a pool of, I don't know, if you're a developer, you would call them test case, unit tests, or integration tests or whatever it is, except now you're doing the testing on contracts instead. So every time a contract is done or a set of data is published, we can start building these little tests and share these tests that we can reuse internationally. So if, for example, and I'll give an example on this. So here's some, like a tender's only got a single bidder. A bid is too close to the budget bids, and and we keep building these little algorithms and tests for the data set from consultation and collaboration with others. So an example again is that, okay, so do these algorithms work or these tests work? You can actually apply it in a totally different country. So Indonesia, for example, actually, which is a neighbor of Malaysia, a little bit south of us, they actually have all their data in open contracting. So because they're doing the same standards, we can actually apply those algorithms that other countries have contributed to and see does it work for Indonesia, as well as certain things that they found in Indonesia, and then tweak that as well. So again, it's a collaboration. So you could actually develop a test for a procurement, say in Chile or in UK, and then actually test it, and somebody in Indonesia can now reuse it and see does it work. Does that algorithm that you found for corruption in UK, does it show up some cases in Indonesia as well? So you can collaborate on kind of algorithms and tests on the data set across countries as well. So yeah, and just to wrap it up, so there's so much out there in terms of open data standards. I have a joke from a friend where I think if you're looking for any sort of experts, just Google for something against poverty. So if you're looking for librarians, just Google librarians against poverty. There's probably a group there working on, archiving and organizing data against poverty. So in a similar way, I usually put some specific thing. It's like health open data standard to see what's there. The ones that I just showed are relatively large and stable and used internationally. So Popula Spec, as you saw, Myanmar, Malaysia, Taiwan, UK, Sunlight as well in the US, open contracting, and this is huge, supported by the World Bank and so on. So that's another standard. There's a subset of it for infrastructure if you're interested in tracking these billion-dollar contract projects by government. There's the beneficial ownership standard as well. I think it's I think the group is originally in the UK, but it's an international collaboration as well. And of course, we have Akomaneto. So if you are interested in building applications to make Parliament more open. Another resource is the Open Data Standards Directory. So Data Standards Directory, this is another great resource. Some of it are country specific, so it's not always an international data standard, but it does provide you some ideas for a whole range of data standards that you could adapt for your own local place, or to build an app, or to collect forms, crime statistics, building permits, and so on. Another great resource in terms of trying to find civil society and partners working around specific sectors. is the State of Open Data report. And on here, you'll see a whole range of different sectors and reports. And from there, you can kind of see the work, the standards and civil society working on open data and standards in this specific field. So this is just a snapshot of some of the things that they work on. So if if you want to see corruption in the oil industry, for example, then you would go to extractive, and there's a standard for that, EITI, I think. And so you can go here to find out what are the fields that you're interested in, and what civil society is working in this area, locally in your region or internationally. And also, don't be limited to just searching on open data standards. Sometimes, as I shared before, sometimes the languages, sometimes you're talking about the same thing, but the language is different. So other people might not actually be using open data standards to describe what they're doing, because that's what the open data people are using. But that does not mean that other people are not working on similar things. So a common place for me is to look for better standards in terms of understanding systems and so on, is to actually look at specialized UN agencies. So if I wanted to understand how food systems are, what data is collected and so on, I would look at the Food and Agriculture Organization, look at their statistics and reports to understand how it works. If I wanted to track modern slavery, human trafficking, labor issues, I would go to the International Labor Organization and then look at their statistics and reports. If I wanted to understand more about child poverty, I would go to UNICEF. So one of the mistakes I did in that form, as you saw, which was pretty poor. Sorry about the background vacuum noise. Was that when I did the initial poverty form in Malaysia, we did social audits for the urban poor. We had some ideas that it had to be multidimensional. It shouldn't just be income. It should include things like health, for example, crime, and so on, to better understand what urban poverty looks like. If we were going to do it better, we should have actually looked at how UNICEF and UNDP was actually measuring these things, and we should have followed their data standards and forms. So not only would our data have contributed back to some of their reports, it would could have been better in terms of adding things that we didn't think about. So same if you're a journalist. There's another network called the Global Investigative Journalism Network. There's a whole lot of different tip sheets, and you can see like what are they looking at, and what kind of data sets that journalists are looking at, and what standards. So I found a whole lot of interesting things on that, like cargo numbers and customs declaration forms and whatnot, that are kind of that are interesting in a different way. So beyond just what we're kind of used to looking at in terms of open data, to look at all these other fields as well. Yep. And that's it for my talk. I wonder if there's any questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Khairil. Yeah. So if you have any questions, you can either open your mic and ask them freely, or you can also put them in the chat if you feel more comfortable, and I can read them through. So I'm going to give some space for like 1 to 2 minutes for people to think of a question. And if you have any questions, is the moment.
Cool. Yeah,
okay. I do have a question, but I wanted someone in the audience to go first, but I think I'm gonna do it. We have been working in Latin America to kind of like create a standard version of, or like standard processes for sharing data, because we have found out that there are several procedures, especially in contracting and in other corruption topics, that are repeating themselves throughout the region. But it's been really hard for organizations who don't really have this tech background, or do not really have any technical abilities or knowledges,
Yeah.
to really engage with the way they collect their data, they storage their data, and they secure also their data. So what are some of the recommendations that you have for, especially for organizations that are very grassrooted and that are not, like, tax is still being something very, like, a taboo topic, and that organizations think is very complicated to deal with, and they're not, since they don't have any like technical knowledge, that they're not going to be able to do the standard procedures for open data. So what are some of the recommendations on that you have had from your experiences on it?
I think I share some. So I was saying that, we're the bridge. Civic tech folks generally tend to be that bridge between the tech and civil society. So usually for these sort of things, what I found is that, so for us as civic tech, is to actually become a part of these communities rather than an outsider. So an example would be is that, let's just say I'm doing something with urban poverty, for example. I would actually find out what groups are working on this, what NGOs are there. I think just the earliest session was on fellowships, right? To actually embed yourself in these organizations, to understand what their needs are. So until you can speak a common language, and understand what their needs are and their issues are. And then once you're kind of part of that community, then you can, and a better understanding of what their issues are, then you start translating that, in terms of actual forms and whatnot. So one example, especially for those civil society which are like low tech, sometimes it can just be improvements in just the paper forms. So one example that we did to help with the urban poverty was that we collected data that was missing before, which was on vaccinations. So everybody knew that health was an issue, but they didn't have the data they didn't understand how they could use it for policy change, for example. So we worked with them and said, okay, we worked with the community and said, okay, let's have these forms that we need this sort of information. It's just paper forms with some details on vaccination and requests. And we actually worked with the community to, for them to help collect this information on health. And once they filled it all in, we were actually able to compile it as statistics and actually give it to the hospital and say, look, this is the statistics on vaccination that we've got from the community here. And this is our evidence, and you should be sending a mobile clinic right here, like as soon as possible, right? So this is a way that we, by going there, we understood the local problems, like, what the community was problems, but we were able to translate it into a way that the policy people could understand. So, yeah. So my advice on that is to be part of these communities that you want to help. I think there's another example that you can try Google. It's also what they did in the Honduras on these kind of infrastructure projects as well. So be a part of that community and start asking lots of questions and be part of them to start building these bridges.
Yeah, thank you. And also I wanted to share, it's not our project, but it's a project of an independent newspaper we have collaborated with in Mexico. It's called Animal Político, like in English is political animal. And it's they developed it, they did an investigation, like a full heavy investigation on some corruption cases in Mexico. And from that on, they discover a series of corruption networks with regarding government institutions, certain politicians, universities too, and some what we called ghost companies. I don't really know the term in English, but fake companies are created to just move money around.
Yeah.
And they created a very interesting platform that's called Synapses. I'm gonna put in the chat. And this tool, what it does is that it kind of helps you out for journalists and for civil society organizations to discover the connections between one company and the other. Like, for example, you put the name of the company there, and it's going to show you the constitutive procedures and all the legal documents, and it's going to tell you who is the owner, who are the presidents and the CEOs, and like all of the information of the companies. That is an effort that journalists have been trying to put forward for quite a long time, and I think it's a really important effort that it was done here in Mexico, and it's been trying to like not only include information in companies in Mexico, but also information in companies in the whole Latin America region, so we can detect the connections for, for example, what's happening in Guatemala in certain corruption cases and organizations, and what's happening in the role these organizations or companies have in Mexico. So I think it's also like a really interesting project to add to all the resources that you have, and that it was made by journalists, and it's like the idea is to help journalists kind of like move forward with corruption cases and have all of the documentation.
So yeah, so that's an example where it's like, okay, where if they, I might actually know some of them, but we'll see. But if they, this is the part where all those things that they learned in terms of what they, in terms of what they uncovered and how the structures of the companies, that kind of input would be really helpful in the beneficial ownership standard, for example, like in terms of how, like what kind of data standards do we need to understand about ownership of companies or these kind of ghost or shell companies. And if they contribute that to, say, the beneficial open standard, and I implement that, then I get all their insights. And even though I might be building a different system in Malaysia, right? So so open standards is that can help build that bridge, capture that knowledge, put it into a standard, and here I am in Malaysia adopting that, and then and what I'm building is going to take on what they've learned there, like in Mexico.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to know if there are any further questions. Again, you can put them in the chat, or you can open your mic and ask freely. I'm going to give 1 more minute so we can, if there are no more questions, we can make a closure afterwards. But I would like to give 1 minute for people to think on a question if they have one.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Hi, my name is Khairil Yusof. I'm from Code for Puerto Rico. Thanks for the presentation. It was really good. I've noticed that it's a bit overwhelming sometimes to get like into standards and to understand. And like you said, sometimes we need to translate from one to another. Is there a space or usefulness to have sort of a translation layer between maybe an open standard that isn't used in a jurisdiction to be able to translate from one to another and have that common language? Or is that just mainly overkill and we should try to just go into more of these open standards? What's your opinion on that?
I mean, it depends on how complicated that standard is. So one example is that, for example, procurement, that's way too complicated. Like, so even I don't understand a whole bunch of it. So for those, I think I shared some examples. For those, sometimes you just have a subset of it, which is more, either that subset is usable for a specific group or a simpler use case than the entire standard. I think the cost example was one such a thing. So they kind of took out the procurement standard and just reduced it to something that was simple just for an infrastructure project. So it's a similar thing to, let's say, maybe the UNICEF statistics on multidimensional is too, like, huge, like every single aspect from crime and so on. So one way is to just maybe just pick the parts of the standard that's just usable or applicable to you, in or your use case, and use that instead.
Gotcha.
And work on, yeah.
Thanks. That makes sense. Thanks a lot.
No worries.
Thank you for that. I didn't know there was a code for Puerto Rico. Welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, we're part of the Code for America Brigade Network, but I've been lurking in the Code for All Slack for a while, just learning from you all. So thanks for putting this up.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, disasters is a perfect example of something that's hugely complicated.
Yeah. We try to work with for the Maria hurricane and all that, and it is quite the complication.
Yeah. So for me, when I try to work in that as a civic tech person, it's like, if it's something new, then I just work on a small subset first before, instead of just diving into the deep end.
Mm-hmm. Yep, makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no further questions, I would like to give a closure on this session. And thank you so much, Khairil, for your participation, for your interest, and for putting out this presentation and sharing all the knowledge and your experience with us.
Yeah.
I'm also, thank all of you who are here and who have stayed throughout the whole sessions that we have so far. Thank you for joining us.